So I'll be dealing with the contents of Chapter 2 and Chapter 3 of Eugene McCarraher's book, The Enchantments of Mammon. And I want to focus in on the things that particularly interested me and hopefully you. So he starts out with, we're at the point of the 17th going into the 18th century. And out of that has developed a philosophy of the benefits of vice. And he references Bernard Mandeville and his Fable of Bees as a representative example of this liberal way of thinking about the goodness of vice or the goodness of self-interest, because with enough people acting upon their self-interest, Adam Smith, also an example of this a little bit later, everybody would be better off. And the Protestant ethic developed alongside that liberal argument about the benefits of vice. And supported it, is what he ends up arguing. And some people then, as Christians, began to see enchantment within the workings of the market. That is, they didn't just say pragmatically, well, this works best because it works with self-interest, which, yes, is kind of sinful, but, we have to deal with the worldly reality of things. Instead, they began to see God's will as working within the market. And he has a lot of evidence of this attitude. And he does mention that this is the same all too bourgeois attitude that was later embraced by Marx, who still held, despite himself, enchanted views of work productivity and achievement as kind of the human activity par excellence. McCarraher writes, the laws of the market discernible by science were, according to this point of view of enchanted market economy, the edicts of an active and ever-present Almighty. And Malthus, famous Malthus, whose philosophy looked at human beings in a very evolutionary way, right? He was an evangelical Protestant thinker who saw life as, quote, the mighty process of God, a process necessary to awaken inert, chaotic matter into spirit. That's a quote from Malthus that McCarraher uses. So he mentions this is beginning to develop, this combination of the evangelical, or more generally Protestant Christianity, with the enchantment of the market and self-interest as a motivating force. He also talks about how enchantment went on in other ways within the Protestant mindset of the day, including a lot of openness to what we would probably call superstition, including mesmerism, which I think was a big deal in the United States, which is basically the power of hypnotism, maybe using it to fix people's mental problems, also maybe to get in touch with the dead, and this was a big deal, seances, the paranormal. To a certain extent, the history of Mormonism gets tied up with this particular type of thing. There was, he says, also in their superstition a certain enthrallment to automation which developed, or a fetishization of the products of labor, use Marxian terminology, or dead labor, machines. Quote, the idea of a vast automaton composed of various mechanical and intellectual organs, cyborging, right? The human and the machine, acting in an uninterrupted concert for the production of a common object, all of them being subordinated to a self-regulating moving force. So this sort of futuristic notion gets started here. And with this in mind, there's this notion that, those who are capable of kind of joining in this progress will thrive, and others will not thrive and will be eliminated. Andrew Ures, who's being quoted here, starvation was then the, quote, judgment of God on the selfish, perverse, and turbulent character of, in his case, writing about the Irish people. Okay? So a lot of people in Ireland died during the potato famine, for instance. Okay, but alongside of this, which McCarraher disapproves of, I think it's safe to say, we have an other Protestant ethic. And this is something that he's going to do throughout this book, it seems, is there's this Christian reality over here, but then there's this Christian reality over here. And so, so in this other Protestant ethic, there's a pushback. There's a pushback against how things are going. It was an affirmation of emotional experience that eventually culminated in evangelical religion and Romanticism. Okay? Through this, quote, other Protestant ethic, the enchantment formerly attributed to the external world was relocated in the individual subjective self. So I know I've already mentioned evangelicalism, and there's different versions of that as well, but what he's getting at here is the type of Christian religion that deals more directly with the spirit. So, and becomes kind of like an avenue for the individual to have direct experience with the spirit. Pentecostalism would be an example that you might be familiar with now. So from this other Protestant worldview, the world was disenchanted, yes, by automation, by industrialization, before that by science, but the self was not, and the self could be the realm of, the inner self could be the realm of connection with God. And in this way of thinking, there was less enchantment of, directly of mammon. So that's going on, okay? He says, this is McCarraher, modern capitalism rests on a metaphysical fault line, a profane, inanimate external world given over to calculation and control, and a hedonistic, enchanted internal realm of daydream, fantasy, and romance. And that sounds kind of bad, like a withdrawal, and to a certain extent, I think it is deemed by McCarraher to be a form of withdrawal. And so he's not completely praising it, but he's observing it. And it's not just withdrawal, it's a retention of the spirit to a certain extent, to try to maintain hold over it. And by the way, I should have said before, you're looking at throughout this particular program at paintings by the English poet William Blake, who is a romantic poet who McCarraher writes about in this book. So I thought that you would enjoy this. A lot of these are illustrations that he did to accompany his poetry. So then along comes full-blown Romanticism, okay, which he says is a radical alternative to Marx and Engels, turning to pre-capitalist values and cultures. So Romanticism as a movement is a pushback, is a resistance to industrialization and to this vision of kind of a future clean of human subjectivity and spirituality. McCarraher writes, from Blake's declamation against dark satanic mills to contemporary ecological activism, so this is where it's still kind of alive today, Romanticism has been an enduring current of witness against capitalist modernity. And as I've said before, Romanticism is going to be a major source of influence for McCarraher. He's not 100% a romantic or any other school, but it is a very big strain in his thinking. So McCarraher will deal with the objections to a romantic turn, and here's where he does it. He says, the invocation of pre-modern and pre-capitalist values has raised the recurrent and not unjustified fear that romantic anti-capitalism leads inexorably to irrationalism, reaction, and even fascism. So there is a connection between romantic thought and fascism, and it runs through reactionary thought, which came out of the French Revolutionary period as a reaction, a conservative reaction to it. So Arthur de Gobineau, for instance, would be a reactionary figure who had some inspiration from romantic thinkers and was to a certain extent himself one. And then that reactionary way of thinking then did feed on into fascism. what McCarraher is saying here is that's not a necessary turn or direction. And so the connection that people make, oh, that leads to fascism, is not necessarily the case. So to continue, he says, yet romantic anti-capitalists affirmed both the Enlightenment and the French Revolution. Whether sympathetic to Jacobinism, like William Blake, Percy Shelley, Heinrich Heine, utopian and libertarian radicalism, Charles Fourier, Moses Hess, Pierre-Joseph Proudhon, Peter Kropotkin, or socialism, William Morris, Ernst Bloch, Herbert Marcuse, the Romantic left has embraced the scientific, cosmopolitan, and democratic legacy of the Enlightenment while also criticizing its limitations. So he understands and knows that there's more than one way Romantic thought leads, and he gives you some clues as to where to look if you want to learn more there. All right, so Romantics didn't see a contradiction, in his view, or at least the ones that he wants to rely on, between reason, democracy, and a re-enchantment of the world. Or to put it more plainly, there's no real reason why human reason cannot exist with religion, okay? The Enlightenment strain that we mostly hear about is the atheistic one. This was what Edmund Burke was reacting to when he said the atheistical fathers of revolution, right? And many of the philosophers that we know the most were very dubious about religion, but they weren't all, right? And there were a variety of opinions. So the Romantics that he draws from, McCarraher draws from, invented, he says, a sort of natural supernaturalism as their heir to the Christian sacramental imagination. Now we know that McCarraher ultimately wants to defend the Christian sacramental imagination, so he's not necessarily embracing a replacement of natural supernaturalism, but he does draw from the Romantics the insight that the world, which goes along with Christian sacramentalism, is sacramental in and of itself. It is incarnational because, according to Christian doctrine, at least seen in a certain light, Christ came into the world, therefore became a part of it, therefore created it and sanctified it. And so there's no reason to see the world apart from the Spirit, and there's no reason to see it as also impervious to or resistant as such to human reason, right? God created human beings as rational creatures. They ought to be able to penetrate a great deal of the natural workings of the world and still see at the same time the natural world as God-filled or Spirit-filled. Okay. He also says their nemesis, that is the Romantics' nemesis or enemy, was reason torn from the fabric of nature and humanity. Okay. Not really understanding what human beings are, that they are spiritual beings, that the natural world is a creation of God, that it is Spirit-filled. To see human beings and nature as purely instrumental, tools to be used, resources to be exploited. This is where there's a rupture, he said, that made a demon and an idol of reason. Now, he notes many Romantics ended up defending monarchy and or elitism and opposing popular government because experience had taught them that popular government coexisted and grew on industry and commerce. And so they began to question whether it could possibly solve these problems. However, their influence, despite the fact that they tended to be Tory, so to speak, in their inclinations, their influence was still strong with thinkers like Oscar Wilde, Leo Tolstoy, Martin Luther King, and Christopher Lasch, to bring it up to date. And so, even if you don't want to go there, right, their insights are still useful. Which brings us to John Ruskin, who is, I think, one of McCarraher's heroes, or one of the chief Romantic thinkers that he draws the most from. His dates are 1819 to 1900. So McCarraher gives an honest portrayal of Ruskin. He says Ruskin insisted that hierarchy was inevitable and extolled the virtues of monarchy, trumpeted the white-skinned splendor and benevolence of British imperialism, deplored the efficiency and productive power of industrial technology, and proposed paternalistic compassion as an antidote to working-class political struggle. So I think, of course, McCarraher rejects full-blown any sort of notion of white-skinned splendor or imperialism, and no doubt also rejects this idea that we must have paternalism or paternalist compassion towards the people, the common people, because we have to have hierarchy. I don't know what McCarraher's position is on whether hierarchy can be eliminated or not, but he probably is not embracing the full-blown notion that people thrive on hierarchy. But despite that, there was so much in Ruskin's thought that McCarraher found attractive. He says that his allegiance was to beauty because it rested on a belief in divine order in which all of creation was soulful. Also, Ruskin viewed the artisan as the icon of human divinity. I've been reading a book by Sennett, The Craftsman, of late, which I think is a pretty good book, and it doesn't make the point about divinity, but it makes the point that craftsmanship is the type of production that keeps your mind fully engaged, and not only your mind, but your spirit and the artfulness of it. It improves over time. It improves both the product as well as the person involved. And so Ruskin's looking at mechanization, automation, and he's thinking, we're going to lose this direct experience with creation. Because for Ruskin, it was a way to sort of co-create. That's a term I'm using. I don't know if he used it, but I think this is the sentiment. Co-create with the divine, or to work with the divine to create something new and beautiful in the world. McCarraher says, affirming human mediocrity, Ruskin warned that the ideal of perfection, taken to its fullest fiendish zenith in the social and technical machinery of the factory, would disfigure the image and likeness of God. So craftsmanship didn't have to do with creating the absolute perfect product that you could then replicate forever. Craftsmanship had more to do with creating the unique and beautiful thing that expresses the unique and beautiful person or persons who made it in their relationship to God, fully realizing that human beings can never be God, that they can never be perfect, and so they can't create perfect things. Ruskin believed that mechanization led to de-skilling, which is kind of hard to argue with, the loss of skills, and dehumanization because no longer can you experience this connection to the Almighty so directly and co-create with the Almighty. McCarraher says Ruskin attempted to reconcile old-school Toryism and old-school communism in a sacramental imagination, the paternalism of the Tory tradition with the fraternal Republican ethos of communism. Well, that ought to make you a little more interested in Ruskin. How do you get Toryism or old-style, English conservatism to go alongside what is old-school communism? So what is that? It's certainly not the Marxist variety. And I'm going to read a little bit more about that in a second, okay? But one last point that he makes in the book is that Ruskin traced the violation of the visible heaven of clouds, air, rain, and ice, reasoning that our sins infected the natural world, composed as it was of matter and spirit. So our pollution, our degradation of the natural world, he could see this was going on. And to him, it was a sin that infected the natural world. Now, there's more on Ruskin in this article, Comrade Ruskin from Plough Magazine, which you can find online, and I'll put a link below. I want to read you just the first few paragraphs. Bear with me. I hope that you stay. I know this is going a bit long. Whose is the wealth of the world but yours? Thus did a radical firebrand address Britain's industrial working class in the summer of 1880, urging them to seize the fruits of their labor. Quote, "Do you mean to go on forever, leaving your wealth to be consumed by the idle, and your virtue to be mocked by the vile? The wealth of the world is yours. Even your common rant and rabble of economists tell you that. No wealth without industry. Who robs you of it then, or beguiles you?" The militant who penned these words was not Karl Marx, though he was then in London working on the last 2 volumes of Capital. Instead, it was a self-professed violent Tory of the old school, who held the post of Slade Professor of Fine Art at Oxford. His name was John Ruskin. Ruskin had been writing open letters to the workmen and laborers of Great Britain since the early 1870s. He titled these missives somewhat enigmatically Fors Clavigera, or Fortune the Nail-Bearer. They cover an array of subjects: work, property, politics, and art. Addressing the working class as my friends, and at the beginning of every epistle he avowed his old-school Toryism in the 10th letter, proudly declaring, quote, "a most sincere love of kings and a dislike of everybody who attempted to disobey them." Yet 2 months earlier, in a previous letter, the lover of monarchs and hater of rebels had proclaimed himself a, quote, "communist," one who was the reddest also of the red. To be sure, Ruskin used the word communist in a sense very different from the one it would carry after the Russian Revolution. In 1871, alarmed by false reports that the insurgents of the Paris Commune had destroyed many of the city's churches and monuments, he rejected what he called the Parisian notion of communism, the belief that all property should be common property. Instead, he wrote, quote, "We communists of the old school think that our property belongs to everybody and everybody's property to us." Therefore, even private property was common in some way, one that Ruskin, alas, didn't specify. Moreover, he believed that everybody must work in common and do common or simple work for his dinner. Ruskin scholars generally pass over this communism as incoherent or ironic, but I want to argue that it was neither. Instead, it represents a road not taken in the history of movements for a just social order. Today, amid renewed outrage over the depredations of globalized capitalism, it's high time to rediscover Ruskin's vision for how people should live and work together. One more paragraph. Marx believed that the resolution of these conflicts lay in the harsh but ultimately liberating trajectory of capitalism itself, whose own internal contradictions would necessarily goad the proletariat into revolution. By contrast, Ruskin rooted his opposition to the tyranny of Mammon in a sacramental humanism which was emphatically Christian. For Marx, communism would be the tragicomic endpoint of capitalist development, but for Ruskin, communism represented the, quote, economy of heaven, a society that would recover the artisanal mastery destroyed by mechanization and would elide the distinction between private property and the common good. With the freely creative person at its center, Ruskin's kind of communism was to be a political economy of love. All right, so we don't know exactly what McCarraher has in mind here, but we know what direction he's headed. And so more on that next time. I'll try to get to 2 or 3 chapters at the same time. I may be doing some separate podcasts for lengthier treatment of some of these topics. If so, I'll let you know.